Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, a geopolitical risk podcast for the specialty insurance market. I'm your host, David Benyon. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about China. This episode is going to cover some difficult and possibly controversial ground. Most notably, we're going to discuss the risk of political interference by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, within Western firms, including insurance companies. This is a topic you don't hear discussed in insurance industry events, but it's one that's become increasingly relevant in today's geopolitical context. I'm pleased to say I'm joined by two wonderful guests today. Firstly, I'd like to welcome George Magnus. George is an independent economist and commentator, a research associate at the China Centre of Oxford University and at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. George is a former chief economist and senior economic advisor at UBS. Nowadays, he writes and is cited regularly in media outlets such as the Financial Times, the Times, and the South China Morning Post. George's latest book, Red Flags: Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, was published in 2019. It examines China's evolution since becoming the People's Republic and its contemporary economic and political challenges. My second guest today is David Worsfold. David is an award-winning freelance journalist with more than 40 years' experience as a journalist writing for national media and for specialist insurance market publications, such as Insurance Post, of which he is a former editor and from which he also launched the British Insurance Awards. David has also written extensively about the insurance market's relationship with China, for publications such as Post, Insider Engage, and his own Worsfold Media website blog. David's conversations with me on this topic have led directly to this conversation today. The first issue today I'd like to talk about is changing corporate attitudes. George, do you see much change in CEOs' stances towards China? I know recently you've looked at the EU Chamber of Commerce as one organisation, for example.
Yes, I think there is change going on. And I think it's also only to be expected that these titans of industry are going to say, decoupling is impossible. And obviously what they are getting at really is the dependence that a lot of companies have on China for revenues and sales and market presence. And why not? Because they've spent the last 20, 25 years building up this kind of China-centric supply chain phenomenon that obviously we know features in the global economy as a whole. And it's not something which is going to go away very quickly. But if you look at the EU Chamber, which represents over 1,700 companies in China, and equivalent or greater number of companies like the US Chamber of Commerce as well, there are smaller chambers like the British Chamber, Swedish Chamber, and so on. You see a kind of a timeline of responses of companies in China. So 5-10 years ago, next to 0 to 5% of companies ever expressed any kind of disquiet or disaffection about doing business in China. Now, it's pretty constant that you get about a 20 to 25% response rate of companies that are unhappy about doing business in China, are thinking about or have already sanctioned future investment outside of China. They're not going home en masse. They're not kind of reshoring, but they are looking to recalibrate and make more reliable supply chains which have become hostage to geopolitics. So there is change going on, but I think it's also horses for courses. If you're selling handbags to Chinese consumers, luxury goods, it's not a problem. If you're doing technology, it's a big problem.
David, you've written about this issue previously. You described the insurance market as intimidated into silence. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of dimensions to that. I think if you step back, you look at how the insurance industry tackled the fear of geopolitical crises, you can see that they just put it in the too hard tray. They really just wouldn't address it. 7 or 8 years ago, I did a major study with Dr. Robert Davis of what was called the Cass Business School, now Bayes, trying to scenario plan various potential crises situations for a group of insurance companies. Geopolitical risks, they just couldn't address them. They couldn't get their heads around them. So there was this whole fear of looking at something that was too difficult to model. I think that's one of the real challenges they face. The insurance industry is obsessed with models, with using data. There is no data to calibrate a geopolitical crisis. There was no data to calibrate what would happen if Putin invaded Ukraine, for instance. So there's intimidation because of the fear of the unknown. But actually, it's slightly more sinister than that, because when I tried 18 months, a year or so ago, to do a major piece on looking at the insurance industry's attitudes to the risks around China, absolutely no one would go on the record for two reasons. Firstly, the supply chain issues that George was just talking about. Everyone's got complex supply chains, and the more international, more global your business is, the more likely there's a Chinese presence in that supply chain. And they're terrified of upsetting those relationships because they know that Chinese firms will react very hostilely towards any potential criticism of the Chinese regime, any raising of issues around Taiwan and so on, and the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang, for instance. So there's the commercial side. And the really sinister part is the fear they have of their own staff being threatened. One chief executive did speak to me off the record and said, last time I spoke to you about this, and I didn't think I said anything particularly controversial, merely flagged up that the risk of conflict around Taiwan in the South China Sea was something we had to look at. I had my Chinese staff in London, they have a presence, this company, in China, and they have a China desk in London, raised issues through our HR department that their families were potentially threatened back in China because I, the chief executive, had said something that might be upsetting to the Chinese authorities.
I think, David, those observations are really, really well taken. I think just kind of to complement that, I mean, I was going to also add the fact that, of course, businesses are used to managing business risk or predictable risk. They do that as a matter of course when they go and set up and produce or supply services overseas. And for many years, I mean, I don't think we should kid ourselves that the People's Republic of China has actually changed on a dime, as it were, in 2012 or 2013. It's always had its idiosyncrasies where the Communist Party has kind of colored the rules of doing business in favor of local firms and in terms of encouraging foreign companies to come to China, quote, share, unquote, their technology and so on and so forth. What's really changed is the politics and about the realization that we, in the kind of liberal-leaning democracies, shall we say, and China, have locked horns in a kind of a struggle of ideas and of values. And now companies find themselves in a place they never really want to get to, which is in the crosshairs of having to decide whose laws they're going to follow and whose laws they're going to flout. And as you say, there have been quite a number of instances, particularly involving American due diligence firms recently, where people have been threatened and been arrested. Local employees, I would say, but also foreigners going to China actually have to be a bit careful nowadays.
Some insurance CEOs have stuck their heads above the parapet a bit more in recent months, and not just off the record, such as in the remarks to David. So if only to appeal for a return to business as usual, if only that were possible. For example, in April, the chairman and CEO of Chubb, Evan Greenberg, used a letter to the insurer's shareholders to urge the US to tone down the rhetoric and symbolism around Taiwan to avoid an overreaction from China. And Hank Greenberg, father of Evan, chairman and CEO of insurance company CV Star, recently signed an open letter to President Biden and President Xi, urging a more robust dialogue to alleviate the heightened temperature. So, David, in the market more generally, do you detect signs of a widespread changing of attitudes among insurance leadership? Or is this conversation not even getting started?
Well, the conversation's definitely started. The Ukraine war is a game changer. There is definitely a change in attitude. When I was writing about these issues at the tail end of 2021, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a complete unwillingness really to address any major geopolitical issue, and particularly China. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has forced them to open their eyes to the potential scale of these risks and also the complexity and the far reach of the way the tentacles of these risks reach out into almost every corner of the market. They're now talking about these risks, and they're potentially talking about China. The Association of Risk Managers, in conjunction with the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, recently produced a report on geopolitical risk. And within that, there was a case study specifically on the risks around conflict arising around Taiwan. That would have been unthinkable. 2 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. WTW recently produced a report on political risks around the world, and China was very much part of that. So the conversation is starting, and I think it's beginning to get real.
George, we've seen significant CCP interference with China's domestic technology sector, such as the arrest of Jack Ma in 2020. He was the CEO of e-commerce site Alibaba. But interfering with Chinese firms is one thing. Has there been evidence of CCP interference within foreign, that is international firms, particularly US or European entities?
Yes, I think the tendency for the Chinese state to interfere with foreign firms actually goes back several years. I mean, countries like Norway, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, more recently Canada, the United States, have all been at various times kind of singled out, and sometimes commercial protests against commerce and against firms have been organized to protest things that the Chinese government didn't really agree with. Mostly these petered out, were cancelled, didn't really have an effect. But they're examples of how the intervention of the state into commerce does actually have a track record. Nowadays, I think the focus is much more acute. So one of the organizations that has crept back into the radar screen of China watchers, really, is an entity called the United Front Work Department, which actually sounds like it ought to be involved in construction, but actually it's not. It's a political organization that was founded during the Civil War in the 1930s, basically designed to align the interests of non-communist party entities and the party itself. Now, this entity really has a rather sort of unglorious record now of interfering with politicians in Australia in particular, but also on campuses in Western economies, including the United Kingdom. In Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, there have been instances where interference in the election of politicians and in the bribery of politicians have come to light. Okay, this may not be firms directly, but this is a kind of a broader intervention or interference than just in firms in China. But industrial espionage, the implementation of diktats about the presence of party committees in any company, domestic or foreign, where there are more than 3 party members. These committees have to sit close to operational management. There are lots of examples, really, of how China is trying to mold the private sector in China, including foreign firms, but much less so than for domestic firms, to mold the private sector so that they fulfill Communist Party goals and objectives. Now, this is a very delicate situation for a lot of foreign firms in China nowadays, and will continue to be.
What do you think the party's aims might be?
That's a good question. I mean, we wonder a lot about what that is and why it seems to be that the party is kind of shooting itself in the foot by doing these kinds of things. It has to be said that, of course, not all firms find themselves in the same boat. So, Elon Musk is persona very grata in China for the Tesla operations, which he runs out of there. And similarly, Beijing has kind of laid out the red carpet for financial firms like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and other companies whose expertise they need in, for example, investment banking, which they're weak at, in the kind of proliferation of more ubiquitous insurance market for life insurance and for product insurance and so on. So it's not completely consistent, but actually the Chinese government is becoming much more sensitive about what foreign firms do and what they broadcast or let out of China. So, for example, the clampdown on due diligence firms. Now, you can't really have a joint venture with anybody in China, and you can't really do trade or business in China unless you know something about the political risks, about the ownership structure of the company that you're involved in, or about any of the kind of issues which might arise in which your shareholders or your government might challenge you about at home. But these companies that do this kind of stuff for American firms now find themselves in a very, very tricky position. As we've said before, some people have been arrested, some firms have shut down, some firms have closed down their research departments. So, they don't really want information to slip out of China. The counter-espionage law, which has just recently been passed or is about to be passed, basically makes it almost impossible, theoretically at least, to say anything. You can't say anything about soil samples. You can't say, if you're doing construction, you can't say anything about the weather in the Taiwan Strait, because that might be deemed to be, a political sensitive topic. You can't say anything about shipping. These things all become matters for Beijing of national security, and therefore they're passing laws, data laws, cybersecurity laws already have come, but also counter-espionage to prevent this from happening.
George, do you think there's still a degree of naivety amongst Western firms when it comes to doing business in China and with Chinese companies? You mentioned there the constant drip of new legislation in China that affects the relationship. The recent so-called data protection laws, which I think came in at the end of April, which are really about data ownership, now require any foreign company that has a relationship with a Chinese company with Chinese citizens to make the data about that available to a government agency. I mean, that's almost unthinkable to Western firms to operate like that. And yet they're still moving into China with what seems to me a degree of naivety or hope that these laws won't be vigorously applied to their sector.
In a way, I sort of understand that, David, because a lot of companies have so much at stake and have built up over decades, their presence there or their involvement there, and, are very reluctant to just kind of let it go. We can kind of understand that, I think. But I also think it is, to some degree, it's easy for me to say, I'm not a CEO or anything like that, but I think it is naive. And I feel a bit kind of encouraged to say that in a way, because just recently there was a Stockholm China conference, which included government officials, business people, executives, scholars, and so on. And The Economist magazine actually wrote this up and said something about, European business is losing its naivety about China. And I thought, since you used the word, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And they did obviously pass comment about the nuances, because obviously in some respects, Europeans feel a little bit less aggressive about export controls and about restriction of engagement, which the United States feels very feisty about. But in many other areas, and maybe it's not shared by European public opinion, according to some recent polling, but in many other areas, it does seem that European businesses are gradually maneuvering away from this open engagement, that there are some bona fide areas of business and of transactions which, we are going to have to be much more cagey about in the future.
If these data protection laws in particular make it much easier for the Chinese Communist Party to finger the collars of those people they don't like around the world, it becomes a very physical and a very personal risk, not just a business risk.
Yes, it is. And in this respect, I think we collectively, have a little bit of catching up to do, right? We have to kind of understand a little bit more about how our data is used, who's using it and for what purpose. And of course, we have our own issues with our own technology companies in this regard. But by and large, I don't think it's a kind of a equivalence, really. We think that these companies aren't passing this information on to the government for nefarious purposes, whereas with regards to the involvement of and the legal position of companies in China with regards to the party state. The Chinese constantly talk about the rule of law, but what they really mean is rule by law. So they have lots of laws, but it's not independent judiciary. You can't appeal. And if you do, obviously, the judge and the court in which you lodge your appeal, these are party people. So they're actually going to rule in favor of the party most of the time, or if not all. So we do have to become much more cagey about what we use, how we provide data, even to the point of the new kind of buzzy thing in technology is the IoT, or the Internet of Things. So these are the chips that sit in your car or your fridge or your products, white technology products at home, which transmit data and which may in many cases be like innocuous, but who knows, So it's not just a question of the kind of telecommunications hiatus that we had with Huawei a little while back and still, but also, a whole range of products and companies from which we have sourced products in China, which may be prejudicial to our interests.
There must come a time when Western enterprises involved in China with business relations with Chinese firms find that they have a conflict between the laws that govern them in their Western home domicile and the laws that are governing them in their operations in China. How should enterprises reconcile that conflict?
I mean, it's quite likely that they'll only be able to reconcile it either by hiving off and maybe part of their businesses. So I don't think this was the driver, but recently there's been quite a lot of publicity about the split in a company called Sequoia Capital, which is basically split off its Chinese arm. There's also been instances where companies, and I'm thinking now about Microsoft, where they've basically taken this decision to take some of their artificial intelligence engineers out of China and relocate them, I think, into Canada or to Vancouver. And there are lots of other kind of case studies or examples, really, where companies are finding it very difficult to comply with, what the Chinese government says they have to comply with in China or with regards to doing business in China and home legislation.
For business leaders who are concerned about these risks, obviously within the insurance sector, what would you advise they could do to be more prepared?
I'd say three things. Firstly, there's no substitute for due diligence. You have to know what your China risk and what your China exposure is with all of your counterparties. And secondly, following on from that, I'd say you have to be always aware about the kind of the state of play in terms of what sort of sectors, products, concepts are basically falling into this kind of national security pot, which both the West and China are very, very keen on and are acting on. So this kind of geopolitical awareness is just something which is just continuing and continuous. And the third is, just to inject a little bit of sunnier optimism into this topic.
We love sunlit uplands.
We love sunny uplands, is to look at the upside from alternative strategies that companies are going to take as they recalibrate supply chains, sources of materials, labor, reshoring, in other words, bringing industry back home and manufacturing back home may be a little bit kind of fanciful at the moment. I mean, some companies may do it, but it may also not be kind of a big trend. But friend-shoring, to give it its horrible name, but actually this is the fragmentation of investment flows, which we are now seeing, where companies are much more inclined to consider transactions, commerce, investment with like-minded countries than with countries that may be at risk of sanction, risk of disruption, risk of threat. So this kind of thing presents opportunities for new business that didn't maybe exist before. So maybe if you take a company like Samsung, I mean, it's been de-risking from China for longer than Apple's even been thinking about it. And Vietnam has been one of the kind of designated end stations, as it were, for Samsung's manufacturing. And things like that, whether it's in Korea or whether it's in Malaysia, or whether it's in Mexico or Turkey or other places, will be beneficiaries of this upheaval, I think.
I'd like to thank David Worsfold and George Magnus for being my guests on the podcast and being so generous with their time and with their insights. I took a few core messages from this conversation. Firstly, that the risk of CCP political interference is real. We do need to talk about China. The insurance industry has been guilty of wishful thinking, neglecting a material political risk for too long already, and putting China in the too hard tray, as David suggested. Secondly, that insurance CEOs might be starting belatedly to consider the risk of political interference by the Chinese Communist Party. This is likely due to the hardening of diplomatic relations in recent months, talk of US-China decoupling, and tensions over Taiwan, which will be a topic of another episode due to record soon. Necessary conversations probably are beginning to happen, but political interference remains an incredibly delicate topic, with much at stake for many firms. And thirdly, that it's prudent to be prepared by taking steps before a crisis occurs, such as those suggested by George. After all, identifying a risk can also mean spotting the next opportunity. Thanks for listening, and please join me next time. You've been listening to the Political Risk Podcast, hosted by me, David Benyon. My guests were David Worsfold and George Magnus. Production by Peter McGill and music by Lawrence Durkin. Thanks for tuning in.